Hello, kia ora tātou, welcome, happy Easter. I'm Finlay Macdonald and welcome to Late. As some of you undoubtedly know, the series for this year is Innovation in all its guises. Tonight we're talking about the economy. A big topic, I know. Everyone's an expert and in their own way, and we all live with the consequences of the decisions made by others and passed down from on high, unless there are any from on high here, in which case, thanks. For a quarter of a century now, we've lived with and within a national economy designed and run along free market lines, from Roger Douglas to Ruth Richardson, Bolger, Shipley, Bill English Mark I, Michael Cullen to Bill English Mark II. We've seen little or no change to the fundamental settings of economic policy, the holy grails of price stability, low inflation that have driven our monetary policy and which has in turn influenced our interest in exchange rates and therefore the fortunes of our productive and non-productive sectors. Of course, I oversimplify. We do only have 1 hour. And there have been pauses, U-turns, softenings and recalibrations along the way. But essentially we have inherited a deregulated economy from those ancient gods of yore known as Rogenomes, some of whom allegedly still walk among us in human form. And yet what was once known, for better or worse, as the New Zealand experiment cannot be said to be entirely successful. By the present government's own admission, we are failing and falling behind in all kinds of ways. Productivity growth, wage parity with Australia, the retention of our youngest and brightest citizens and future entrepreneurs. More trenchant critics of the current economic orthodoxy also point out we have become increasingly, they'd say glaringly, unequal as a society in those 25 years. Our social problems from crime and child abuse to poverty and teenage pregnancy are the result, they will say, of an economic strategy that has benefited a few but disadvantaged too many. We've sold assets, but seem to have little to show for it, since we're still broke. We're hooked on credit, obsessed with real estate and scared of the share market, and who can blame us? With regulatory bodies missing in action, a corporate governance culture, the envy of Nigeria, and the corpses of finance companies mounting faster than Mark Hodgson and Eric Watson can release a new investment prospectus. Even the odd flinty-eyed business executive and leader will allow that our single-minded pursuit of low inflation has hobbled manufacturers and hindered export growth. Everywhere it seems there are voices saying we can do better. Excuse me. And 3 of them are sitting up here with me tonight. In the middle, Brian Gaynor, Executive Director of Milford Asset Management, regular commentator on financial matters and one of the best reasons for buying the Weekend Herald for his searingly insightful business column. Next to me, Susan St. John, Associate Professor of Economics at Auckland University on the Management Committee of the Child Poverty Action Group and highly respected commentator on the social and economic implications of tax and welfare policy. And to my far left, not figuratively, just physically, Tim Hazledine, Professor of, he's to the right from your perspective, Professor of Economics at Auckland University, author of Taking New Zealand Seriously, The Economics of Decency, and whose specialties include competition and competition policy and economic reform in developed and transition economies. Please welcome our guests. I had a different intro, but as chance would have it, the New Zealand Institute released its report card this week. I'm sure some of you will have read about it in various newspapers, which is sort of, it's a report card on the New Zealand economy and society. Generally found us rather wanting. Various categories received a rating from A to D. We got no A's, and overall we rated a C+, I think. Some areas were very poor. Assault mortality, D. Household wealth, D. Innovation and business sophistication, D. CO2 emissions and concentrations, D. GDP per capita, C. Suicide, C. Unemployment, C. Most tellingly, perhaps, on the category of inequality, that is the wealth gap and the state of those at the poor end, we rated another D. I don't know about you, but it was one of those moments where you read the paper and think, why do I live here again? So I just thought I'd begin by asking each of our panelists briefly, just to tell me their reactions to that report and whether they thought it was an accurate snapshot, and if so, why. Tim?
Well, good evening. Finlay, you've just about done the whole thing already, I think. Can we go to the music now, please? Okay, well, first of all, I would like to say how pleased I am to be here, and not just to be here this evening in this room, but I'd also like to say, in case I forget to say it later, that I'm a very happy citizen of this fine city and of this country, and I have a good life, and I enjoy it very much. And if I forget to sort of say positive things like that later on, please forgive me, but those things are true. Having said that, I'm obviously one of the lucky ones, because there are problems in this country. And all those C's and D's and whatever's on the New Zealand Institute's scorecard that Finlay reminded us of, there's one there's one that stands out from all of them, and it probably is responsible for all the other ones, and that's the inequality one. And I think tonight, I won't say more than that now, but I hope we'll talk a bit about that. I think it's actually the biggest trend in the developed world economies over the last 25 years before the sort of recent disturbances of global warming and the global meltdown, is the widening of the gap of earned incomes, especially between the very rich and everybody else. So that's going to be a focus of things that I'll say tonight.
Which, Susan, I would imagine you would have something to say about as well, since you've made, well, if not a career, certainly an interesting hobby out of studying our inequality and our wealth gaps and the problems besetting welfare beneficiaries and the poor. Did you think the Institute's report went far enough? Do you think it was hard-hitting enough? Was it accurate? Was it honest?
I think it was all of those things, but could I say, first of all, like Tim, I'm very pleased to be here. It's
so nice.
I feel a very privileged member of the New Zealand society, and I enjoy living in New Zealand and hope that I don't say too many negative things as well. But to go back to the report, I thought the interesting thing about the report was that it comes from an institute that has corporate backing. And for that reason, I think that New Zealanders should just take a bit of notice of it. But I'm a bit depressed because it follows a range of other reports from UNICEF, from OECD, to say nothing of our internal reports from Salvation Army, Council of Christian Social Science, the rest of the reports that come and clutter up my room. They come out, they're looked at, a couple of days later, they're gone and nobody remembers them. So what do we do about that? Why are we so indifferent to this dreadful outcome that we have in society in New Zealand?
One of the reasons we got a D, according to the Institute, was that very point, I think. They specifically said the lack of recognition and response to the reality of this growing inequality problem was what marked us down. It's not something that we're talking about properly, whereas in fact it's probably, as Tim pointed out, the problem.
Yes, and when we have the leading paediatricians telling us that we have third world diseases in New Zealand, and that we've got outcomes for children almost worse than the OECD, why is it not on the front page of the Herald?
I think it is sometimes though, isn't it?
Very rarely. Well, this last report wasn't.
I thought the Herald loved to tell us bad news. Now listen, Brian, I know that you're happy to be here too, and that you're a privileged member of this society, and
well, no,
so
I'm actually going to take a different stance to my two colleagues, because I think that their reflection is probably one of the things that frustrates me. Everyone says how happy we are, but actually we're a country that is very much underperforming, and if we look to the future, it's not so much us, it's the generations that are coming after us that you've got to have some concern about. Let me say just two things. First of all, to me, GDP per capita isn't a judgment. There's all kinds of things like inequality, suicide, lack of innovation, lack of wealth. But one of the key things to me is a country's ability to be able to create jobs for its brightest graduates. And I came from a country, Ireland, where we all emigrated in the 60s, 70s, and the country was a failure because most of the people who left universities deserted and went all around the world. I never thought I'd see that in New Zealand, but it's becoming more and more common. We are not able to deliver job, careers, prospects, and the type of society that a lot of our top-class graduates want. And that's a really concern in the future. The reason why it's a major concern is because the greying of our society is going to be the one most predictable thing that we can talk about.
This seems to be John Key's one big bright idea. We've got to catch up with Australia. The joke, of course, is how to find ways to make them slow down. What's your feeling about that on the surface as a goal? Is it rhetoric? Is it just electoral policy, or do you actually think it's a sensible way of approaching our own economic management, trying to catch up with Australia? Susan?
Well, one of my fears is that we do hark back to the neoliberal experiment and we reinvent it in different ways when we know that it's failed. So if we're going to catch up with Australia, one of the policies is that we should have low taxes, even though in Australia they've got a highly progressive tax structure. So there's an ideology, there's a belief that somehow the answer will be found if we can only free up the free market a bit more, even though when we go back to the 90s, we know that created all sorts of problems, leaky homes amongst them.
But I don't worry too much about closing the gap with Australia. Good luck to the Australians, and we can always go there and work there. And everyone in this room almost could do that, and you've chosen not to. It probably means you haven't got a yacht, or you'd be out on the harbour by now. But apart from that, you've
also,
chosen...
a healthy Australian economy is good for New Zealand
It's good
regardless,
for New Zealand
isn't it?
Too, the trade stuff and everything. I think it's back to this issue of closing the gaps inside New Zealand, the gaps between rich and poor.
Brian, you know plenty of people in the business community, obviously, and as you were saying before we began, so many of them say a version of, oh, look, let's not dwell on the past. Let's not go back and fight those old battles. I do wonder whether you think there is some kind of fundamental character difference between New Zealanders and, say, Australians or other nationalities when it comes to entrepreneurialism, all of the things that feed that. Are we, in some way that we don't quite discuss, culturally hobbled or hidebound?
Yeah, I think that we have a problem with our DNA as far as our economy is concerned. And let me try to explain it simply. To me, I look at New Zealand, three different sectors. There's the government sector, there's the agricultural sector, and there's us urban folk. And if you look at the history in New Zealand, it was completely dominated. All the wealth was created by the urban centre, and the government actually built our big companies, electricity companies, the telecoms, the Air New Zealand, is all all our the airports were all built by the government. And the reforms of 1950 were effectively a response to the fact that the agricultural sector was struggling because of England joining the EEC. So we want to put some wind in the sails of the urban centre. Well, that's exactly what the government did, but we've absolutely failed. I would say that, and I'm talking collectively, not about me or anyone else in this room or the rest of you, we have not lived, instead of actually putting our head to the grindstone and really setting up good strategies to grow the economy, we're obsessed with property, we're obsessed with family trusts, we're obsessed with the 3Bs, the batch, the boat, and the BMW. We haven't really done the things I go to Australia quite regularly, and I find the business community very ambitious. I don't detect the same kind of ambition here. We sell things as soon as somebody comes along for with the first offer. So I wonder whether, we talk about policies and we talk about deregulation, whether we actually have the DNA in the urban sectors. And look at this for a contrast. All over the communist world, the governments have got out of people's affairs, and they've allowed the private sector, the urban sector, to kind of gain control of the economies. Look what's happened in China. Look what's happened right through Southeast Asia and Europe. As soon as the government stepped down, the urban people have really picked things up and grown their economies. We haven't done that. We have finance companies. We have share market booms. We've got quick rich schemes. We've got property bubbles. But we really don't seem to be able to grow the type of businesses and have the enterprise. And that was one of the things that came up in the Institute's report. We haven't got the innovation or the enterprise that other countries have. So it all comes back to us, really. It's not governments or government policies or taxes. It's whether we really want to improve the performance of the country. And I don't detect that is actually true.
So we're just a selfish nation, really.
Well, we're blinded by short-term considerations. The quick rich schemes are...
See, it's interesting you say short-term because My bugbear would not be we don't have the economic growth DNA, we don't have the planning DNA, and I don't mean that in a command economy sense. We are short-termist. We are a bit of a rip-off culture, a get-rich-quick, get-out, I'm all right, Jack, which is quite contrary to our self-image, I think, to some extent.
Yeah, we don't, I look at it at companies, and there are a few New Zealand companies who have really got some great plans. They don't get a lot of support because it's hard to convince New Zealand investors about what might happen in 3 or 4 years' time. That's too far ahead. Now, I'm not saying in every other country people are perfect, but we're not able quite to be able to keep that vision. So therefore, the capital isn't there, the savings aren't there for companies who've got the vision. So they rise and crash and burn very quickly. And unless we decide to be brave and take risks and to be innovative and to do things more creatively, we will drop behind in the end. And it's not policies to me, it's us as individuals.
I think I'm a little bit concerned that I'm hearing that it's our fault. And I wonder how much it's a failure of regulation, a failure of good government, the government setting the appropriate environment so that people can flourish. I mean, the average person who invested in the finance companies thought they were acting in good faith. They were being the good people. They were saving, which we're told is a good thing to do.
Oh, absolutely, that's quite true. But why is it that we get a proliferation of people running those finance companies? What is it that's in our culture that allows that? Yeah, regulation is one, but it's not very clear. I mean, the thing about the finance companies, which was extraordinary, it's a totally unregulated area. So people had the choice of putting their money into the banks, which were totally regulated, and into finance companies, which were totally unregulated. And yet, a huge amount of people put their money into an unregulated sector where there was no rules whatsoever.
But we had Richard Long on the television telling us that we should do that.
Exactly. So why did Richard Long sell himself for that? I mean, we got to ask those kind of questions. What was Richard Long and what was Colin Meads, and why were they taking money for things that they didn't quite understand? Why is...
But do we attack that by getting them to understand it better, or is it the other way, and we look at the control of those activities and the regulatory environment?
Well, it's a combination of regulation and hoping that people will try to understand and do the work.
I wanted to ask something that's particularly interests me, because there is a global movement at the moment, and Gordon Brown in the UK is a supporter of it. He gets laughed at by his own chancellor and the head of the the bank and so on, Bank of England. But for a what they call the Robin Hood tax, the financial transactions tax, and in an era when we've arguably lost a lot of economic sovereignty, most of our big industries are owned offshore anyway. Does the panel think that there's an argument for such a tax in theory and in practice?
Well, in theory maybe, but in practice it's very unpractical because financial transactions are now cross-border, just like the internet is cross-border. And for example, only about 12% of the New Zealand dollar transactions occur in New Zealand. Most of it occurs in London or New York between non-New Zealand participants. And it's very hard for a New Zealand government to try to tax those transactions, just as it's becoming very difficult to control the internet. So I think that practically yes, in theory yes, in practice no, because of the internationalization of finance.
Well, it could be done multilaterally if everyone did it, but there's a lateral thinking way out of that particular problem, Brian, which is to stop having a currency that can be traded in this way. I don't think we're in the right business with our own monetary policy and a currency in New Zealand. We've been in these overseas markets, apparently, the 11th most heavily traded currency in the world.
Seems absurd.
Well, that's just a poker game that we don't want to be playing in, I think. And so I'm not sure about this or dogmatic about it, but even Don Brash, last time I talked to him about it, said, well, we didn't rule this out in our report, the possibility of begging or whatever it takes Australia to have a joint currency.
What about some way of managing our exchange rate so that manufacturers aren't whacked every time, and perhaps some of those logs will get turned into nice furniture or something?
Well,
if they
I don't know if we can go back to controlling our exchange rate. I think we either let it rip or have a Tobin tax, which might help, might not, or stop having one altogether by currency union with Australia.
What about our interest rates, Tim?
They'd come down, wouldn't they? 2 percentage points. The Australian level.
But should we manage them down to achieve a lower currency?
Oh, so if you lower interest rates, oh dear.
Jeez.
Well, I don't think we
It's
can.
like a meeting of the Reserve Bank Board, isn't it?
Interest rates.
I don't think we have any sharp instruments left to do that with. I don't think.
Well, I mean, you've actually got to the nub of it, really, haven't you? We have no tools. The experiment, has gone off the rails. We're told that something in our DNA has caused us to be dysfunctional at an economic level.
And we're happy.
But not for long. I'd like to thank tonight's guests, Tim Hazledine, Brian Gaynor and Susan St John, for their contributions to this panel discussion at Auckland Museum.